those of you who live outside of the state of California, what I'm going to be talking about is going to seem unbelievably bizarre. When you go to acquire a firearm from a licensed gun dealer, you actually participate in two separate transactions. There is a federal event that takes place as well as a state event. And then this information is sent to Sacramento. It's sent to the Department of Justice. Now, at this point, after they hit submit, a mandatory 10-day waiting period is initiated. This is interesting and I'm going to argue unconstitutional. All right, guys, before we begin, I want to mention that USCCA is doing a secret giveaway, and you can actually participate for free just by going into the description of this video below. Now, this little promotion ends very, very soon, so do it quickly. Now, I'll give you a hint. What they're giving away, it can fit in your holster. My name's Stephen Lieberman. I'm with the law offices of Lieberman and Taormina. I'm also one of the co-owners of the Artemis Defense Institute in Southern California. Today, we are going to be talking about the dreaded indeterminate status. What I'm going to be talking about is going to seem unbelievably bizarre, but this is what California residents have had to put up with really since the late 1990s. When you go to acquire a firearm from a licensed gun dealer, you actually participate in two separate transactions. There is a federal event that takes place as well as a state event. The federal side, you fill out what is referred to as a 4473 form. We've all done this before. This is that federal document that you put down all of your particulars on and everything else, and then you sign, and that is ultimately retained by the FFL indefinitely. At the same time that you're doing this, in California, the clerk behind the counter is filling out something called a DROS. Now, a DROS is an acronym for Dealer Record of Sale, and this is an internet-based document that they're filling out. It's a website that all dealers participate in. They fill out substantively the identical information that you're filling out as it relates to you. And then this information is sent to Sacramento. It's sent to the Department of Justice. Now, at this point, after they hit submit, a mandatory 10-day waiting period is initiated. This is interesting, and I'm going to argue unconstitutional, okay? So now that we have the Bruin analysis from New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin, things that potentially can affect someone's ability to exercise their Second Amendment rights are now have to be studied based on a constitutional test of history, text, and tradition. Going back and looking at this 10-day waiting period, I would argue violates that standard. Now, with a little nuanced approach, okay, for somebody who is acquiring a firearm for the very first time, there may be a bit of a wrinkle in that. We can discuss that in a subsequent video. But for somebody who clearly already is in possession of firearms, a 10-day waiting period, or what is oftentimes referred to as a cooling off period, I think bears no constitutional validity. That being said, we do have this statutory 10-day waiting period right at the moment. We also have a 30-day opportunity for the Department of Justice to engage in a background investigation to determine whether or not the individual is in fact not a prohibited person. Now, that seems kind of odd, right? We've got a 10-day period and we've got a 30-day period. Well, within the 10-day period, about 95% of the time, the Department of Justice is able to conduct their background investigation, and it ultimately will be decided that this is not a prohibited person, and the dealer is given an authorization to release the gun to the purchaser when they come to the shop 10 days later to pick up their gun. And this actually visually manifests itself on the DROS website, or what's actually called the DES website. When you come in, they pull up your record and they'll see an actual button that becomes clickable on your page that says approve, deliver the gun. Now, sometimes the Department of Justice is not able to conduct their full background investigation in that 10-day period of time. They will then issue what is referred to as a delay. And 10 days later, when the person comes to pick up their gun, they won't be able to get it because there'll be this delay, and you can't click on that. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't tell you when the delay is going to come off. We simply know that there's another 20 days that the Department of Justice could hold up the delivery of this firearm while they conduct a deeper investigation. Now, at a certain point, oftentimes the delay will turn into an approval, and then the applicant comes back and they click on the button and they get their gun. But every so often, it will come up with what is called indeterminate, and this will usually take place on the 30th day. Now, I will also tell you that sometimes they flat out deny the applicant, right? They find something in their background that they think creates a prohibited person status, and they just issue a flat out denial. The nice thing, if you can call it that, about a denial is that by getting denied, that now forces the Department of Justice to send the purchaser a physical letter in the mail explaining under what code theory they have been denied. And sometimes they flat out get it wrong. They have misidentification. They're confusing the applicant with somebody else, or their records are inappropriate. And this now allows the applicant to challenge through an appeal the denial. The rub is that sometimes people get this vague, indeterminate status. Essentially, the Department of Justice has said, you know, we think there might be something in this person's background, but we're not 100% sure. So rather than giving a formal approval or a formal denial, we're going to punt. We're going to allow the individual gun dealer to make a decision as to whether or not they are going to allow them to take possession of the firearm. Now, what's interesting is that if it is an indeterminate status, the Department of Justice is under no obligation to send that letter to the applicant saying this is where we have a problem. They are basically left to wonder what it was that caused this indeterminate status. Now, the gun dealers, especially the more corporatized gun dealers, you know, the Bass Pros and Cabela's and Turner's Outdoorsmen and groups like that, they have a corporate policy that an indeterminate is the functional equivalent to a denial. They will not release a firearm to a purchaser on an indeterminate status. A lot of mom and pop FFLs or independent gun stores, they take the exact opposite position. Their attitude, which I will argue is the correct attitude, is that you have a fundamental civil right to have access to this gun. And unless the state can show by empirical evidence why you, as a specifically identified individual, are a prohibited person and should not have access to the gun, then the presumption is you should. And, you know, here you go, Mr. or Mrs. Purchaser, here's your firearm. Sadly, not all companies take that position. And that actually creates a little interesting legal conundrum on the part of the person who's trying to challenge this. Because when we make the argument that this person is essentially being prohibited from exercising their fundamental, specifically enumerated Second Amendment rights, the opposition, in this case the Department of Justice, their response is, no, they're not. They still have avenues where they could be able to acquire a firearm. They just happen to choose a retailer who's made the position that they're not going to release, but there's other retailers who will, all right? So this becomes problematic in and of itself. Now, I will tell you that in the past, maybe once a year or something like that, I would get a phone call from somebody who had received one of these indeterminate statuses. Now, over the last 2 months, I have probably fielded, in all candor, probably about 40 separate phone calls from people who had just effectively been denied their civil rights because they had received an indeterminate status. So one of two things are in play. A lot more people are attempting to purchase firearms, which is, legitimate and actually a good thing. Number two, and what I suspect, is the DOJ is taking a position where anything that potentially could be investigated and dispelled with is now creating this indeterminate status. Now, here's the problem associated with that. You, as a citizen, are under absolutely no obligation to maintain records about your past, which shows that you are able to exercise your civil rights. Okay, the presumption is always that you are able to exercise all of your specifically enumerated civil rights. Okay, it is up to the state to show with empirical evidence that you are not. Now, when the state sits there and says, and I've heard this argument before, well, we have some records, some court records that are incomplete. If they were complete, they could potentially show that this applicant is, in fact, a prohibited person. Well, how the hell is that the responsibility of the applicant? Okay, the fact of the matter is the judicial system has done a poor job of maintaining their records, and in absence of clear and convincing evidence that this particular applicant should not have a gun, then the presumption must be that they should. Coming up with this indeterminate status, in my opinion, is in fact a violation of their constitutional rights. And, like I said, I believe is ultimately going to be challengeable under Bruin. In any event, it's a major problem that we've got right now, and it's something that's going to ultimately have to be addressed. I suspect that in California, it's not going to take place in the legislature. They are more than happy in denying people the ability to exercise their civil rights. I think ultimately speaking, it's going to have to come through the judicial process with one of these things being challenged. Unfortunately, as with everything, that takes time and money. So, again, I urge all of you, all right, train constantly, train consistently, train repetitively, and train with purpose. Above all else, stay safe.